Those who know me might be surprised I'm speaking in the affirmative here. I'm a committed believer in the philosophy and practice of nonviolence, particularly nonviolent resistance. I believe in it both morally and I believe in it strategically. And yet I'm speaking here in the affirmative about the threat of violence being an important check in the political system. That's very strange for somebody whose biggest heroes include Gandhi and MLK. But there's something that a lot of people don't know about Gandhi that I think is really important, which is that Gandhi offered a hierarchy of moral goods. When faced with oppression and injustice, the highest good was nonviolent resistance. But the next highest good was violent resistance against injustice. And the lowest form of morality, in his opinion, was passivity or tolerance of grave injustice and oppression. In fact, he was asked a question about this after he himself had been nearly stabbed to death in an attack on him. And for those who don't know, he would later be killed for his nonviolent work, as the previous questioner noted. Nonviolent practitioners, the nonviolence was only one directional. And they asked if his son was there, if he would have told his son to engage in to be nonviolent with the guy who was trying to stab him to death. And he said, the most noble thing to do would be for my son to jump in front to protect his father, take the stabbing himself, and potentially die himself to prevent the wrong being done. But if he didn't have the courage to do that, the next most noble thing to do would be to fight and kill the guy who was trying to kill me. But that it would be a disgrace for his son to stand there and do nothing while his father was stabbed to death. I believe fervently that nonviolence is the right answer, and that nonviolence is more effective in most American political contexts, though not all. But certainly in our current context, I found that the nonviolent protests after George Floyd's death did much better or good for the cause than some of the rioting that followed. And I just think that's a strategic point that's worth naming for anybody like myself who cares about the issues that those people were protesting for and who protested myself for them. But it is far worse morally and politically to sit passively in the face of oppression and violence than to do something. And I would say that for those who believe in, like I do, in Martin Luther King's legacy, we should not forget that part of the reason that others chose him was because he was the alternative to Malcolm, and the threat that came from the violent movements was part of why people embraced his nonviolence. And with that, I get the question.
Thank you, Speaker. Jazz hands for the speaker. And we're going to move to questions. I'd like to call on a first questioner, Rebecca Feaster. Please address your question to the chair.
Hello, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Loud and clear. Thank you.
I'd like to ask the speaker about how does he differentiate between the violent protesters versus the nonviolent protesters? You mentioned the fact that there was some great success with the nonviolent opponents. And the reason why this is significant for me is I was in Scottsdale and I saw 3 weeks worth of protests. First week was extremely violent. Stores were decimated. And then 2 weeks later, another group came in from Arizona State University and they had a very peaceful march with the assistance of the city's mayor and the police department. So I'm kind of interested in the differentiating between, the violence versus the ones that are there for social context.
Thank you for that question. Silas?
So I think that there's a moral difference and there's a practical difference. The moral difference is when you engage in nonviolence, and I mean nonviolence of the sort that puts your own body in a line of fire and that takes consequences on yourself as a way of revealing the injustice that other people are doing to you, not the kind that just is relatively calm and not particularly agitated. I mean the kind that is active. Those who engage in nonviolence when they take a moral risk and they take a physical risk, they bear that risk. And I think that's morally superior because we're not always right when we think that we know what the best answer is. We're not always right when we think that we know what's going on and that in somebody else's motivations or in the situation. And if you kill someone because you think they're wrong, only to discover that you were the one who's wrong, their blood is on your hands. Whereas if you risk that yourself, you're risking your own self and your own, both your body and your morality for what you believe in, which I think is more noble morally. Secondly, strategically, one is aimed at persuasion and conversion of your enemy into your ally or the passive bystander into your supporter. The other strategically tends to be aimed at basically causing a big ruckus that makes people want to give into your demands because of fear of that. So it's a sort of fear-based tactic. Generally speaking, that works better when you can provoke a lot more fear. So revolutions are quite scary and often provoke reform. Violent protests in a country that's not close to revolution often don't provoke a lot of reform. They provoke a lot of repression.
Okay, speakers, thank you for that answer very much. And then one more question for the speaker. Let's go to Rita Chisholm. Rita, could you unmute yourself and address the question to the chair?
Thank you so much. I hope this isn't repetitive, but what about the lives of those that are truly innocent, but those that are protesting take lives, wantonly because of the protest, and that causes a ripple effect. They don't only kill one person; they kill many other lives with the taking of one life.
Thank you for that question.
So I don't think the question is repetitive. I think it's very important. When it comes to violence against oppression, and particularly the threat of violence, which I think is important to distinguish those two, but when it comes to violence against oppression, you better be clear about who you're targeting with that violence. And I think one of the biggest, both strategic and moral mistakes that is made when people choose the path of violence, which, as I said, is not the path that I would choose and not the path that I think is most noble, but I think is better than nothing, better than passivity, better than allowing oppression. The biggest mistake they make is choosing the wrong targets. If somebody is doing wrong to you and you do wrong back to them, that's called self-defense. And even if that self-defense is against somebody who's authorized to do wrong to you, I think that you stand a lot better political, strategic, and moral ground in doing that wrong. But when you target somebody who is not the promoter of that injustice, either because you're angry or because you're caught up in a crowd fever, then you do harm to your cause both morally and strategically.
The speaker is thanked. Jazz hand.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the questioner. And we're going to go to our next speech, which is in the negative. It's a 3-minute speech, and I want to call on Harry Hirsch. Harry, please unmute yourself.
If this were any other era of American or even human history, I would have 100% agreed with the previous speaker about everything he said. However, it seems to me like the game has changed, literally as of last year. Peaceful methods now have the potential to be more effective and scalable than violent ones when it comes to protecting our rights and our well-being and enacting large-scale institutional change more than they ever were before. And I would say literally as of last year. Now, I will acknowledge that many countries around the world have invested a lot of money, effort, and personnel into the police forces and militaries, those war-making institutions. And of course, to the best of my knowledge, none of them have a peace-weaving institution which employs diplomats from all walks of life, and certainly not such an institution on a scale remotely close to that of their militaries or police forces. But I think the reason why not is probably because until last year, we hadn't met all 3 of the necessary preconditions we needed to for such an institution to be feasible. 1, we needed a big enough population of problem solvers looking at things from a wide enough variety of angles. 2, we needed a big enough resource abundance and production capacity to support that larger population. And 3, we needed a big enough fraction of that population who have their time freed up so they can actually work on the problems that actually matter to them, to their communities and societies in the first place. the big population boom over the last 2 centuries, the resource abundance that we got from technology over the last century or so, and then the automation fueled job losses over the past couple decades or so, culminating in the COVID related layoffs of last year. So far as I can tell, all 3 of these thresholds have been met as of last year, to a critical mass level. So, and if that's the case, that means that if you're still relying on violence as a standard method for securing your rights and well-being or for enacting large-scale institutional change, then you're not being creative enough. You're not thinking outside the box. I would also add that in any other era, someone like me probably would never have been able to come up with these kinds of ideas, express them coherently, or explain them in a way that made sense, or even talk about them and be heard and listened to, like what is happening right here and now. Not a stupid, ignorant, half autistic ward of the state like me, whose only official credential is a BA in English. I don't need violence to win my freedom. I don't need violence to win my freedom. And if someone like me does not need violence to win his freedom, then does anyone? I don't think so. It looks to me like the game has changed, and most people just haven't noticed that yet because they're still experiencing too much hostility, trauma, pain, rage, distrust, and learned helplessness.
Harry, your time is up. So just if you want to wrap it up with your final thought, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I think those feelings were inherited from generation to generation for a very, very long time. But I don't think we actually need to be like that anymore. At least not on a large scale. Like if somebody's trying to approach you with a weapon, like in the moment, and yeah, it makes sense to defend yourself with violence. But like on a large scale institutional change sort of level, I don't think it's necessary anymore. Like we just need to be more creative about things.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Just a little tip is you could probably step back from your microphone a little bit because it's a little bit loud, but we were able to hear you really well. So thank you for that. And I'd like to take questions for the speaker. I believe that Hattie may have a question and was unable to raise her hand. But Hattie, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, please address it to the chair.
My question is that, so the speaker mentioned people outside the US that are relying on their police forces that are violent. And so my question is that I know quite a few people that are outside the US who are not US citizens, they're citizens of other countries. And several of them have voiced the same question to me about the social unrest in this country over the past year. And so this question that they're asking is not one that I necessarily agree with. I don't, but the question that what they're saying is essentially that they see this violence in our country as their question is their belief. They say, well, it's not the question of whether the citizens have the right to be violent because anyone can be violent at any time. The question is how the state responds. And that's what we see the problem as, is that citizens in the United States are not coming to the same conclusion about whether the state responds. And most of these people that I'm talking to are in countries that have much more repressive police forces than our country. So I guess my question is like, what do you say to that? That it's not about how the citizens respond, but about the problem or the way that police and the government is responding.
Thank you for that question, Hattie. Really appreciate it. Harry?
Yeah, I would say that it's all fine and well to, point fingers and to focus on whoever's most at fault for the problems that we're dealing with. However, we have to think about what actually works and how to actually get to the point where we can even reach them in the first place. I would say that since I'm not the government, and since my vote, so far as I can tell, because of gerrymandering, because of the very partisan, districting and all of like the winner take all stuff, plus the fact that the powers that be are so far removed from the common person, like we're not really having those conversations with them all much of the time, and there isn't really much avenues to have conversations with them in the first place. How are they supposed to know what we want or what we need if they aren't, if we can't talk to them and they don't have and there's no clear path for them to hear us? So I would say in order to make that possible, we need to actually like build the infrastructure, build those webs of mutual exchanges, and sort of like domino effects, and sort of spread it out until we can get, until we can reach them, until we can actually talk and be heard by them in a way that they'll actually hear it. Because right now we're like ants on the ground and they can't see us. We're too small for them to see.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And we have another question from Silas. Did you have your hand raised for a question? Please address the question to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank Mr. Hirsch for his fine speech. I'd like to ask the speaker, Mr. Chair, if his basic argument is that in the past violence might have been needed, but now we have other means, what he makes of the non-linear movement of history towards justice. Specifically, what I mean is, if a person was a member of the European Jewish population circa 1900, they might have said, we've faced oppression, but things have gotten better for us now. What they wouldn't know is that 50 years down the road, the Holocaust was coming and 90% of them would be killed. This notion of history reaching a point where we no longer need the threat of fighting back to defend ourselves against governments that seek to do us great harm seems to me to be rather optimistic, and I'm curious if he believes it's really we've come to that stopping point in history.
Thank you for that question. Harry, please.
I don't think it's a matter of a stopping point per se. I think it's a matter of the game has changed. It's not that violence will no longer ever be necessary. It will still be necessary sometimes to protect ourselves on like if someone's like literally coming to your door and like with a gun or something, yeah, you have to defend yourself. But in terms of enacting large-scale institutional change, that I do not think we'll need violence for anymore. I think that if we can be creative enough and diplomatic enough and actually build the grassroots connections we need to build, then at this point we have, because I feel like one of the main reasons that previous points in history, violence was necessary to such an extent on such a large scale is because there were not enough resources to go around. If people tried back then to use much more peaceful methods back then, and rely on them more heavily, then the problem is if there's not enough resources to go around, then somebody will end up losing out. That if you try to get everybody on board and get everybody peaceful with each other and respect everybody's concerns and bridge everything, then at least some people would have starved.
Thank you, Harry. Appreciate that. And jazz hands for the speaker. And we will go to the next 2-minute speech in the affirmative. Kirk J. Can you unmute yourself? And
unmuted, and I've.
You're good to go. 2 minutes.
All right, perfect. I think my argument here is I just don't think that nonviolence is an effective system under today's political and economic systems. Like, yes, someone did mention there's a good study out there that nonviolence is better at convincing people. David Shor got canceled for trying to retweet that study. But I think the problem with that is that public opinion fundamentally doesn't matter under our modern public political systems. You go abroad, the Arab Spring fails, all these protests to overthrow regimes fail. You have EU ministers who say that we can't let elections get in the way of economic policy. And you go to the United States, where it seems that no matter how we vote, even when we agree on things, it just doesn't happen. People go to DC, we all want this thing to happen, and it doesn't happen. And there's a good study out there, I think some guys at Princeton, who said that Congress is essentially only responsive to roughly the top 9% of like the population here. And the question is, if convincing people doesn't really work, then what's really the point of nonviolence? If you're trying to fundamentally change a system and the power structures under that system, like we live under, you can't really rule out any tactic categorically. Now, obviously not every use, and honestly, the vast majority of uses of violence would be horribly ineffective, but there's a lot of examples of violence succeeding. People bring up the Civil War. People brought up the violence in the streets last year, and that was pretty effective. You know, but then the question is, you have to wonder is why is it effective? In general, violence goes from the top to the bottom. Even the concept is a little arbitrary. There's a lot of ways to harm someone. Take this idea of cancel culture. If you get someone fired, they lose their job, they lose their health insurance. That's a lot worse to them than actually just punching them in the face. We don't live in a society where the state has a monopoly on violence. I mean, essentially, economic, cultural, social violence has been privatized widely throughout this country, and it's used by the people on top towards the people at the bottom. And going back to the point, if someone at the bottom, decides to reverse the thing, like I'm not gonna sit there screaming and saying, "Oh, violence is bad, and you guys got to stop," because it's kind of the everyday of our society. I mean, the example of top to bottom violence is a lot of the violence last year.
Thank you, Kirk. Thank you very much. And we're going to go to a question from Nancy Martin. Nancy, unmute yourself.
Mr. Chair, I have a question for the speaker. And you were talking about convincing people as far as, to make a change. And I'm curious how you think that violence can convince people of something, how it can make a real change in how they really think.
Okay, I guess, Mr. Chair, to answer the question that was posed to me, I just think convincing people doesn't really matter under today's political and economic systems. Like, our public opinions just don't matter anymore. And to the extent that we want a system where our public opinions do matter, the way we get there isn't actually by changing people's opinions, because we all want to, right now, I think almost all of us want to live in a democratic system, but that's not what we live in. And if we want to get to that point, the way we get there isn't by convincing us, basically preaching to the choir. It's by doing more systematic changes, more strategic changes, more dramatic things that actually get us to where we want to be, which is, that is what the American Revolution was about, right? We didn't convince people in this country that they should be a different country, because most people already thought that, and people took muskets and made it happen.
Speakers thanked. Jazz hands for the speaker. And we're going to move to the next 2-minute speech in the negative from Amy DeConnick. Amy, you can unmute yourself, 2 minutes. Amy, are you there?
I was having difficulty with my technology here.
No, we can hear you. Go ahead. Yeah.
I first want to praise several of the speakers who have gone before me for eloquently making excellent points. I'm going to recapitulate, whatever. Some of those briefly. The concept that violence begets more violence, the concept that there are costs beyond health and life when violence is used. I'm going to share a few personal perspectives. So this is, again, my personal view. I grew up thinking that it was the responsibility of the US to fight for democracy in countries that had tyrannical government. But most of the individuals involved in that fight, the soldiers, weren't in the government. They had families and loved ones who would mourn their loss, who would be pained by their loss. I married a person of a minoritized race. When the police pull him over in North Carolina, in Kentucky, in Tennessee, and Texas for being dark-skinned, I fear that it may be the last time that he gets pulled over. But I distinguish between self-defense and violence. Attacking or threatening an agitated officer who is better armed will not improve the situation. Fighting the individual will not stop similarly trained officers engaging in similar actions. Violence has costs. I mentioned the health and life of those involved, but it's also the emotional pain of their loved ones. It's also the economic costs. Businesses avoid violent areas, the collateral damage of the violence on physical structures. More than the threat of violence, it is the loss of power that tends to motivate people in power to resist. To quote Gandhi, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. While I can understand that violence against oppression seems like a solution, it only establishes a new oppressor. A cure to a disease is not more of that disease. Curing violent oppression with violence is self-defeating.
Thank you, Amy. The speaker is thanked.